Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since a friend made me aware of your work and reading some what I perceive to be really insightful insights into leadership and just even the world of handling complexity, not looking to solve tension but hold it or to stand in it essentially. I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Well, thank you. I think you just summed up what I was going to talk about. So maybe we don't even need this conversation because you've summarised my work better than I can do myself. But thank you for that.
Well, we shall proceed for a few minutes anyway, Richard,
Yeah.
and see where we go, right? So,
Yes.
the question which I usually start this with, of course, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Yeah. I mean, I think over the last 15 years, there's been one question, and it's how did leadership, this thing that we've come up with to help us navigate complexity, how has it actually ended up turning so many smart, decent people into performative, burnt-out shell husks? That really is what drives me, I think. Now, I think I'm being a bit dramatic, but kind of deliberately so. But not too much, I don't think, because I mean that's where I work. I work at the intersection of leadership development and systemic dysfunction, so I see this gap all the time. And I see the gap between the leadership people are performing and the actual work that they're quietly doing just to hold things together. So they go out into the world and they say, "I'm doing this," and then you talk to them and they're really struggling to hold things together at multiple different levels. So I've been trying to help people notice that gap for many years, and help them find their way back to some kind of leadership that's a bit more human, a bit more developmental, and a little bit more honest. And I think one of the things that we might be able to talk about is the challenge of doing that, because they think they're doing that anyway because of the stuff they read, because they're all into transformational leadership and authentic leadership and servant leadership. And they say, well, that's all human. And I say, well, yes, but it's not based on evidence. And that's also a bit of a challenge. And if you go into the world and you expect to do A and to get B, and you're using something that has no evidential base, well, no wonder you begin to fall apart and collapse. So when I talk about human, I don't mean that. I actually mean stuff that looks at that really explains how people perform well or how people lead well in complex systems. And I think you mentioned it, how they hold the tension. Not necessarily how they answer problems, but how do they hold the tension for themselves and for others to get these systems moving. So I think that really is perhaps a secondary answer to the question that's moved me towards is, can we stop teaching leadership like it's a superhero costume? And let's start treating it as reflective, relational, role-aware practice instead. So I hope that's a reasonable answer to your first question.
It's a gorgeous answer, to be honest, and resonates a lot with, I guess, how even just maybe I might even look at humans, even in just their in how we approach life in terms of almost having this idea of life and in the process not paying attention to the experience of life and almost ideas and models for relating as opposed to paying attention to the person in front of you. When you say, just out of interest, when you say the idea of honest, could you elaborate just a bit on that? Because I've got a tons of assumptions and projections around that. I'd just like to hear from your point of view.
I think I'm not sure I'm talking about honest in terms of you're always brutally honest to
No.
the people in front of you, because sometimes you actually do have to hold on to things that they're not allowed to hear because of systemic pressures and strategic imperatives, etc. But I think when I talk about being honest is being brutally honest to yourself. That what you do is underpinned by an awareness of why you're doing it. And I think to sort of your point that people don't pay attention to that. They're not really aware of why they're acting the way they're acting. And I think maybe a better way of talking about this is like an unrealized dishonesty of self. That they say, I've got these values and I'm this great person, and then you say, but you just did that. And they say, yeah, but that's not me. Well, who was it then? Because I didn't see somebody else doing it. I saw you doing it. But that's not the authentic me. So that's you acting inauthentically in the world. Is it someone else? You put That kind of stuff, where people are being desperately dishonest to themselves, I think is where I would ground honesty in this conversation.
This is there's something so kind of poignantly comedic about that, and yet I'm sure if whoever's listening to this could maybe even have heard themselves utter those words,
Well, I'm
and
sure you and I
definitely,
have said it as well in the past. I
yeah, oh,
mean, it's a human condition.
absolutely,
Yeah,
like yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, completely. And I think that there's I don't know how this fits with you, but I think that I think it's almost like just an essential part of the journey even to move through that.
Mhm.
Like to catch yourself in the awareness of, okay, I've absorbed a lot of information or ideas. Maybe I've read several books in different fields, and this is what I'm supposed to be. And then we take these intellectual ideas and think now that we understand them, that we are them, or that we live it. And then life will humble you very quickly if you're paying attention and if you're
Mhm.
reflecting, to catch yourself in a kind of an unraveling explanation like you've just kind of offered up there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, one of the things I talk about is the beginnings of being tangled or drifting or stretching, and I think it emerges. This disjunction emerges that way. You might have talked about yourself as being a highly capable and effective leader, and you get pushed up a level, and suddenly you're stretched. You're stretched because you're taking on more than you expected to take on, and you start performing in a way that you don't feel is the you that you want to be. But you don't know what to do about it because there's no scaffolding to help you develop any further. Or again, as you move up a level, you're suddenly tangled because you've got these competing demands on you. And you kind of talk about yourself as being a good person. Well, you can't be good to that demand and that demand simultaneously. You've actually got to be a bit more rigorous, maybe a little bit more brutal. There's things you have to do that might move you away from the self that you think you are. And if you're very unlucky, you start to drift or break. You start to lose, you can't deal with this, and you start to kind of lose engagement and begin to become a little bit cynical. And then eventually your sense of self might completely break, because you've always framed yourself as being this person, and now you're not, and you don't know what to do about it. So that kind of, I see that a lot. That those we don't tend to have the language for this. I mean, people just kind of say I'm a failure, not I'm in a stretch threshold or I'm in a tangled threshold. They kind of see themselves as broken and failing because we don't scaffold them to move through those levels and prepare them for. I mean, we don't even begin to prepare them for the next level of leadership. We just throw them in and say, right, you've been promoted, and suddenly you've got all of these things going on that you've never experienced before, and you're totally not prepared for. And you just say, oh, but I'm a good, authentic person. Well, it doesn't help because you've got to wrestle with this stuff. So what do you do? And I mean, that really kind of sums up a lot of the work that I try to do. Is, well, okay, you're in this position. You're not going to solve the contradictions. They're always going to be there. You're not suddenly going to get rid of the workload that's stretching you. It's always going to be there. Yes, you can choose to drift, but that risks break. What are you going to do? Um, how do you lift yourself up? How do you become this leader that you've always said you are, but you're now actually not performing effectively anymore? And so that, of course, is a major challenge for somebody's sense of self in that environment. And that kind of goes back to the notion of honesty, because they're then dishonest to themselves about that. They actually have to say, well, honestly, I'm not ready for this. I'm not as effective as I thought I was. What am I going to do about it? And of course, you've then got ego defenses coming in left, right, and centre when that's the case. So yeah, I see this. I mean, every 9 out of every 10 leaders are wrestling with an aspect of this, and the 10th one probably shouldn't be a leader in the first place because they're not wrestling with it. And the whole point of leadership is you are wrestling with it all the time.
For you, either with people that you're exploring this with, or even yourself, because I think what you're describing too, there's a really clear parallel as how I perceive it to be in terms of just a human's self-reflective journey.
Mm-hmm.
The capacity to see all sorts of contradictions, hold paradox, be over, be overwhelmed almost to the point of view of breaking, or to the point of maybe even just accepting or surrendering in a non kind of passive sense, if you get me, to just to what is. From your perspective, what do you think occurs for that, for a person then, when they do actually go, okay, I had this clear view of myself. Maybe it was slightly thin in terms of the dimensions that allowed me to be, or reality. It contradicts a lot with reality. What do you sense kind of allows people to rest into that, to that experience a bit more?
Well, I mean, I think you've already talked about it. It is reflection.
Mm,
They start reflecting not just on themselves but on the situation, and they start to try and draw in different angles and different opinions about what they may be able to do. And this is why coaching has become such a big industry. Is they need somebody to bounce off against. So, how am I going to, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? I think reflection is a big element of how they cope. But I don't think everybody copes. I mean, the journey is full of people breaking down and burning out. It's full of unhappy consciousness. It's full of despair. It's full of, that they don't get over the threshold. So for everybody that does, there's somebody that doesn't. Um, there are coping mechanisms. I mean, people can become stoic, they can become skeptical, they can kind of cope, and then they stick with the rest of their life in that coping mechanism. They don't really grow. The growth requires you to become unhappy, and I think that's one of the big challenges is that people think growth is kind of this natural positive process. Oh, look, I'm growing. It requires unhappiness. It's leaning into discomfort, and you've got to be ready to lean into that discomfort. So reflection would be part of it, a helping hand, a coach, the capacity to read other things that are a little bit different from what you're wrestling with, to try and move your mind to see things in different ways. Experimentation, trial and error, willingness to do something and it not being the right thing. I think that potentially is the most important thing. You're willing to do something, because doing nothing is the worst thing you can do. And doing something wrong is better than doing nothing. So you try and it's wrong, and by knowing it's wrong, you might get closer to doing the right thing. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, and I think one of the big challenges is we don't talk with enough depth about the things that are going on. We kind of smooth it over and kind of go, "Oh, it's just a nice life cycle, and eventually you're going to transcend into this super heroic figure that everybody listens to, and you're full of charisma, and you're full." They don't talk about the breaks. They don't talk about the stretches. They don't talk about the tangles. They don't talk about the discomfort. And I think that's why a lot of people end up burning out and breaking down, because they think they can carry it all on their own shoulders. And then they move into a space that they're not ready for, and there's no help to help them get through. And they feel stuck. There's nowhere to turn. They don't know who to turn to. There might be because they've always just relied on themselves and they've had the cognitive capacity to get that far by themselves. But eventually, we all end up in a system that's too complex for us to understand, and we need help. And I think a lot of people struggle to ask for that help when they get into that situation.
It's, you can almost see, as you're talking there, it kind of lays out the idea. By the way, when you said the idea of growth just being this seamless thing and this wonderful thing, I almost had this idea of a child looking around and his parents going, "Look, mom, look, dad, I'm cycling now," like almost like I'm growing. And we just kind of forget the part, well, yeah, learning how to ride a bike also involves falling off and cutting your knee as well. You know, but with this sentiment though of just how we, you can understand then if someone adopts a coping mechanism and you keep on kind of just getting through maybe different iterations of what growth may have carried you through, but you just keep leaning into that, how it almost becomes your own kind of prison then in ways, because you haven't acknowledged the depth of it, the experience of it, and maybe the idea of yourself becomes so compelling that you almost don't want to chip away at that. From your perspective, just what is it that allows? What's kind of hopeful in helping that or moving that person towards the either the deeper expression of it, or even asking more explicitly, even asking for help? How do you see people navigate that?
So, I mean, it's interesting because you've evoked one of perhaps modern philosophy's first ideas, Plato's cave, the psychic prison. I'm stuck in a version of reality. It's you're in a cave where there's a flickering light and shadows on the wall, and you think that's the world. You don't
Mm,
realise there's this rich, luscious landscape outside the cave door because your back's to it and you're just seeing the light. And so the challenge is how do you lead somebody out of the cave? And now there's no guaranteed way to actually do that, because people are very happy in their cave, and it's a very scary thing to go and to go outside the cave. I mean, if you've watched the cartoon The Croods, that's how it starts. They won't go outside of the cave because it's this big scary world. And we, what one of the things I think that's again is as old as this idea that we trap ourselves in our own psychic prisons, is that dialogue gets you out of it. Talk to people. Not talk to people to tell them what you think is real, but talk to people to understand what they think is real and ask
right.
those interesting questions. So if you're in that kind of, there's got to be more. I'm really stressed. I don't know how to do this. You've got to let go of the fact that your opinion, even though it might have always been the right opinion, you might have always been the smartest person in the room. You've got to let go of that and go and ask people. So, well, what are you seeing? What are you listening to? How can I have a talk to you? How can you probe my way of thinking? Um, and it can be there's a whole different way of doing this kind of dialogue. I mean, it can be as simple as go and grab a 15-minute cup of coffee with somebody and shoot the breeze with them and see what emerges. See if there's anything that it can be very formalized through a whole bunch of different things that you can do in meetings to get people to ask meaningful questions and tell meaningful stories and ask you questions. And some of the questions we use when we do this kind of work is someone will present an idea and we'll ask the person who might be stuck in this cave, well, okay, you just heard all of this. What was confirmed and reinforced? And of course, that's an easy question to answer. Oh, like they told me this, I already know that. They told me that, I already know that. And they told me that, I already. Okay, great. Okay, what was new and challenging? Okay, that's a more difficult question because I wasn't really listening for the new and challenging, but they can normally answer that a couple of times. And you say, right, what was unclear? What questions do you still have? And you probe for them to kind of go, well, I didn't quite understand that, or that doesn't. And then you say, well, okay, how can you use this? These things that were new and challenging, and these things we've now clarified. How might you go and use this in the world? That's another technique. So there are very many techniques, but they're always dialogic. They're
Mm.
always kind of interweaved as well. I don't know if you've come across interwoven learning, but this idea that you don't do things in a stream. You talk about this, and then you bring in something else, and you the conversations are unfinished. So things percolate in your mind, and that gives you a much greater recall. Where something half finished conversation 3 weeks ago, and suddenly you're doing something else, and that conversation, you go, oh wow, that conversation was about this. What can I remember? How can I do that? So one of the things we talk about in the work we do is you're trying to create the dialogic atmosphere that's similar to what happens after the second glass of red wine at a dinner party, where most of the barriers have come down and the conversation is flowing. And if you actually watch it, you'll see groups form and split and change, and because it's such a flow. And if the conversation is flowing, then you're able to start asking questions and learn in a very different way, which can help you move out of the cave, of the psychic prison. There's no guarantee, and I think it's always important to say there's no guarantee. But the more you do this kind of work, the more likely you're going to be able to take that first step.
I love the fact that I think you may have said two or three times over the course of this conversation so far that there's no guarantee. Um, I think that's such an important part of this. If it's to be truly in the spirit of the dialogue that you're talking about there, and it resonates a lot with me, both in way I approach kind of personal conversations, but also in some roles that I might work with teams as well. I love the idea that it's almost these just almost like these standalone dots they can appear as at times, and the idea that it doesn't have to be finished. I think that's one of the most containing and constraining and limiting aspects in just even a regular dialogue with a friend, a family member, a lover over even a conflict. The idea that if we meet right now, we have to deal with it right now and we have to come away with a solution which everyone agrees with. And I think sometimes agreement is so overrated. And really, can we just surface fragments
Mm.
of ideas that we have no idea how they fit right now, but even just in their surfacing or expression, they exist within our field of consciousness or awareness right now, that they have some capacity to do something that we could never predict in, in a week's time, in a month's time. Just from your perspective, when did that develop for you? Like just that kind of broader perspective of dialogue, and it clearly not
Mm.
being, you mentioned the stream there, not being so, I know this idea of non-linear is a bit overused at this point in time, but truly to almost to have all these things suspended and to be okay with their existence rather than necessarily their ordering.
Well, I think I've always been involved in in kind of corporate education, and I think that the core part of this is I started boring myself when I presented. And so if I'm boring myself, I'm thinking, well, what the hell am I doing to the participants in the room? Is there not a way to make this a little bit more interesting for them? Is there not a way to turn this into dialogue? And so, in order to stop being boring, it was how do I turn this into kind of more dialogic exercises? And then the feedback started coming in saying, this is amazing. We're learning so much from this. But they were as much learning from each other as they were learning from me. They were learning at other people's interpretations of what I was presenting as the trainer and the facilitator. And so, I mean, it was all very simple. I mean, this was way before lots of the core ideas about biologic learning that sort of litter the web at the moment, that I certainly wasn't aware of them, even if they were out there. It was just about seeding conversations and get people to talk amongst each other in a friendly manner about the kind of topics that were meaningful for the work that they were trying to do. So it was really lived experience. But I mean, I can give an example myself of something that I for me is one of the most powerful things that I've experienced in a dialogic setting. And this was when we were talking. I run dialogic workshops on an ongoing basis, and we, a bit like you interview people in your podcast, we invite people to host them from all over the world. And we had someone called Nicola Robbins, who we'd asked to talk about Indigenous leadership in Africa. And she was talking about the role of the shaman in the African tribal systems. And she said something during that has stuck in my head ever since. So she was basically saying that the tribe goes and they're hunting everywhere, and they find a rich seam of hunting, a fertile hunting land where they can kill all the big antelope or whatever they're hunting. And she says, the tribe will normally they risk killing off all the animals by continuing in this space. The shaman's role is to act as a random number generator
Hmm.
in the decision making. It's not about them predicting reality or talking about reality or having a sixth sight or something. It's about using signals and symbols and things to generate a random number that stops the tribe doing what they're doing. Because if you continue doing that, it ends up being a disaster because you kill everything, and gets them to think about doing things in different ways. Now, when I had Nicola talk about this kind of stuff, I didn't think that I would hear something that I constantly use nowadays, because I constantly see it now. Whereas, throw in something random and see what happens. But to actually have it laid out as a formal way of leading was just phenomenal. And it was a moment in a dialogue that happened. It wasn't even her that said it. I think it was somebody else who asked her, "Is it about random number generation?" And she said yes. And that moment is something that's changed the way I think about Indigenous leadership, and I now have embedded it hugely into the work that I do because it's hugely sophisticated. But you have to have those moments that get you to, and it's allowed me to change the way I think about things, to write differently about things because it's such a big moment for me. This is not unsophisticated, and arguably, this is what we're missing in the West. We don't have a random number generator in leadership in the West. That's just seen as dissent or the person whose head you should chop off, not a formal role. And so stuff like that is, I have to live it myself, but I've lived it A as a facilitator, but B as being somebody facilitated. I think it's incredibly powerful because, as I said, there's no guarantee, but some moments, I mean, you jump 15 levels in one step
Yeah.
when it does happen. And so, even though there's no guarantee, there's also possibilities of moving and accelerating incredibly far and incredibly fast.
Just a couple of questions arose there, but just one in terms of that experience of this lady sharing that with you, and even someone else decoding it further or putting the language that you would have seen on it. What was that like for you? In your, like, just even, was it a, did you have a rush of something in your body as you were listening to this, or how would you even describe that
No,
moment?
I don't. I don't even think the immediate. I think the immediate thing was an aha, but
Okay.
I think it took 2 or 3 weeks to properly percolate. So it was sitting in the back of my head, and I was doing a lot of writing at the time. I was designing a program, and it was just always there in everything that I was
Right.
doing. So it wasn't this massive rush of, oh, that is the answer, but there was an aha moment that then helped me through all the other stuff I was doing. And now it's something I think I can talk about with a degree of sophistication because I've used it. And I think that's what development looks like. You find that the thing that anchors you in this new moment, and you begin to use it, and then you become a little bit more sophisticated, and you can see it everywhere, and you can begin to use it everywhere. But it's not an instant rush. It's not like love at first sight. It grows and it matures.
Yeah. For you, just what is that? What do you think is occurring within that sense of a like introducing something random in, like and I don't mean it to be interpreted so explicitly, if you know what I mean, but just what you think is occurring. Like, I've my ideas just even around like people feeling a sense of aliveness. Even the way you kind of described how leadership people are being almost ground into submission or reduced to certain states, almost like just, and even when you describe this kind of complexity or sophistication that seems to be inherent in some of this
Mm.
indigenous leadership that seems to be absent from the West, some Western ideas around leadership or management. What do you sense is being introduced to the group in those moments?
I think it's the opportunity to improvise
Yeah.
more than anything else. Because I mean, again, I've experienced seeing elements of the leadership discourse being presented in a way that nobody can improvise. It's just this is reality, and you get locked into the frameworks and the models. And there's no way you can talk about it meaningfully because you're kind of this is the only way to do it. Whereas if you're allowed to improvise, if you're just saying, oh, here's another way of thinking about it, what do you think? And it's random, it's not expected. So it's about introducing, certainly in the leadership space. I mean, we introduce things from complexity science, we introduce things from trust modeling, and a whole bunch of things that seem quite random but are actually really important. Um, it gets people to think about what they're doing from a different angle. It's a bit like pulling someone out of Plato's cave again. It's just there are other things going on that you haven't thought about. How do you use this to anchor yourself and create a different lens and a different perspective? Feel free to improvise. Don't feel like the only thing you can talk about is this frame. I mean, that's the reductive aspect of leadership. You can only talk about things inside this little box, not you can explore. And not just leadership. I mean, I think you can throw the vast majority of education practice into that box. Talk about this, stay in your lane, don't improvise, just know. And that's not good enough for the complex world we live in today.
There's something, isn't there, about just the almost the deadening aspect of that, like fixing a component of life in a certain spot that we're going to explore, and not allow almost for everything that exists within in and around that. Like it's almost separating something from the rest of existence and not seeing the contagion or just the influence of or the interdependence or interconnection of things, and saying this is what we're going to focus on. Just even the way you said it there and holding your hands up like this, like it really is a sense of just like almost fixing something in a place. Like it becomes, I don't know, the more I kind of explore some of these things, it becomes more apparent just how stifling some of our more traditional ideas on even on learning is
Mm.
in the context of whether it's education, whether it's even our ideas about each other when it comes to learning about each other in interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, I would agree. And but as much as I don't like to, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Michael Gove, where he says, I think the public have had enough of experts. And
Yeah.
he missed out three important words. He should have said, I think the public have had enough of experts in complex systems. Because expertise in complex systems doesn't help, because it says, here's the answer. This one thing is the answer. And a complex system is by nature, it doesn't respond to one person saying this is the answer. It's got ambiguity embedded in it, it's got volatility embedded in it. Cause and effects are not obvious. So when you get, we haven't had enough of experts in a system we know how it works. You can't go to an aeroplane manufacturer and say, well, we've had enough of experts in aeroplane manufacturing. Let's just get people in who are random people from the street. You can't do that. But when it's a complex system, when all kinds of interpretations are possible, then expertise kind of it fixes you into this corner that you then can't escape from. And I think that's what we're seeing. As the world becomes more and more complex, and even in the notions of the self, everybody says, well, I've got to be this authentic one thing. The worst thing that happens is in the leadership space is somebody does a disc profile and say, oh, I'm a red. And you know all of your complex self, you're a colour. I mean, it's
Yeah.
one of the worst things that anybody can say to me. Oh, I'm a red. And it's like, really? But I hear it all too often. Um, and it reduces all the complexity of self to something that is meaningless and abstract and cold, and it's not human. And you can think of that, we don't understand ourselves, which are incredibly complex. We don't understand the systems, which are incredibly complex. But we keep on asking for experts to reduce these complex things into something that we can hold, rather than developing ourselves into people who can actually thrive in these conditions. Now, I think that we potentially will never get enough people who we're never going to get a situation where everybody can thrive, but there are ways to develop people to actually start thriving, and then they can hold more and more of the complexity to allow other people to flourish. But I think our entire way of thinking about this is in the wrong direction at the moment. Leadership is one aspect of it, but education, care, a whole bunch of things all do the same thing. And I think Gove was right. The expert is the challenge, but only when you throw complexity into the mix. Without complexity, the expert could be the exact thing that you need. And I think that's so. That for me, that really sums up where we are or what the problem is in the leadership discourse, but what the problem generally is in the human condition nowadays. We need to become far more reflexive. We need to be able to model ourselves on an ongoing basis. We are improvising, sense making, storytelling animals. No, you're a red. You're this little thing in the corner, and don't move outside that box. And I think it's deeply inhuman to talk about ourselves that way.
I agree with you, and the idea as well of just trying this authentic self. I think we've once again. I think these are these are almost rites of passage to get caught in this. I absolutely had a fixed idea of authenticity when I first kind of explored with that myself. Um, only if I'm a chatty person, I find myself in a library. Is it authentic to just suddenly keep chatting loudly while in a library? Like, do you know, I'm being a bit crude with that, but even just, I think it's more this like coherence with ourselves, or an expression, or a transparency of what's occurring right now. And I think so many of our ideas, where they get tripped up or where they get flawed, it's almost looking for a final destination, a resting place where we no longer have to wrestle. And maybe it's the evolution of, like, well, maybe there could be a sense of too much resistance in the wrestling, or or something like that, or more of an acceptance of how it is, but still not a, like, just an awareness that this life is constantly churning, it's constantly moving, we're constantly in new situations, we're always learning new, we're always finding out new aspects of ourselves through new experiences, which life will offer if we're allowing it to. Just, you've mentioned a lot of the ways in which we lose, and even just focusing on that I'm a red notion, that we lose our sense of humanity within this. Even when you were talking about what you'd like to bring to management, or ideas around leadership, is more human, more developmental, more honest. What is that? And mentioning some of these capacities of ours to have different dialogues. What is it for you when you think about that human element? Maybe even just in terms of what's missing, or how we've even got to this point, and how you kind of see this as something helpful moving forward.
Well, I think the thing that makes us most human is our interdependencies. We're not animals in the wild. We have built roles and systems, and that largely is what makes us human. So I think I'm generally quite clear on this. We are cells in roles and systems. Now, the system, it might be the political system, it might be the geopolitical system, it might be it might be the educational system that you're in, it might be a corporate system. There are all kinds of different systems, and they're nested in other systems. And we're all part. We can't escape that. We can't say, "Oh, I'm authentically separated from this system. This system doesn't impact me whatsoever." You can separate yourself from lots of its core values if you wish, but you're still embedded in a social system of some kind, a complex social system, and you play a role or roles in that social system: father, brother, friend, employee, employer, whatever the roles are. And each social role has a whole bunch of performative parts that you need to be able to do reasonably well in order to play that role well enough to give the system what it needs from it. And when I talk about leadership, my core complaint is that leadership role is not well defined enough for anyone to play it well. How can you play a role that's not proper, that's not defined? It's almost impossible to do. And then finally, you have the self, which is, well, how do I? Yes, I've got these red tendencies or these green tendencies or whatever tendencies to action and behaviour you tend to have, but you need to be able to adapt them to play the roles. You need to be able to grow them. Now, and if you're in a corporate space, that role will be vertical. You're going to move up a system. So as you move up a system, you need to take on more and more of the complexity. So that means you need to grow the role that outwards as well as upwards. You can't just be this little narrow thing that goes up. You need to be able to adapt yourself more and more to the greater complexities of the role. And the greater complexities of the role needs you to be able to understand greater complexities of the system. So that, for me, is the core of the ongoing journey. Self in role and system. Adapt the self to play the role according to the system's needs. And you can add, if you want to say, well, I want to bring a bit of my authentic self into that role. Now, I would argue that the authentic self doesn't exist, and that you have a preferred self that you tell stories about. And you want to say, I want to take a bit of that self into the role. So I want to turn this role into something that integrates with my preferred story about myself. Then you can do that. And you can actually say, right, this role, it's kind of defined this way, and I just need to shift it 5 degrees to the right in order to make it more aligned with who I wish to be. And that's perfectly good. I would highly recommend people try to do that. As they go, right, this role doesn't quite fit me. How can I bring in the bits of me that I want to bring into this role to make it fit better? And I think if you get stretched, if your preferred version of self gets stretched too far away from the role you're being asked to play, that's when breakdown can begin to occur. So for me, it's always interdependent, self role system. There's always fluidity and adaptivity between these systems. You need to adapt the self to play the role. You need to adapt the role to the system requirements. The biggest challenge then is adapting the system. That's beyond the capacity of most of us. We might have a little bit of the system we have span of control over that we can adapt, but we can't adapt the wider system because it's just so big. So we can respond to it in a reflective way, and that's all we can do.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because a question that was kind of arising for me there was around the sense of, if on a wider basis, or even if the leadership started actually living, these ideas of more reflection, more bringing more randomness into situations or into dialogues and different scenarios. At what point do you sense that this then is something that the system itself is responding to? Like, because this, if this were adopted, and I mean really not in some lip service kind of way, this would be quite. I never like the word radical, like radical honesty, radical. It's just a thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, being honest is honest, or or in whatever way you mean that. But just it would be, even in I'd say in a lot of private people's relationships, notions like this would be quite a shift from where it's presently kind of behaving. How do you kind of sense that moving
Well,
then between the system and the individual?
I've been lucky enough to work with people who have listened to this stuff and have actually operationalized it.
Yeah,
Because otherwise, I wouldn't be able to talk about it. Because if it doesn't actually work in practice, then it's just another bullshit theory about leadership that we can throw away and just say it's somebody else making something up. So what basically happens is so we frame the dimensions of the leadership role very very specifically within the context. So some of the frame is quite universal, but some of it's extremely specific to the context of the job. And you say, right, how do you play that role well? Where are you now? Where do you need to be? How do I help you grow? How do you illustrate to me that you're growing? What's your deliverable? What's your growth deliverable, etc., etc. We kind of do all of that. In terms of how that happens, so I generally work with pretty senior people who've got teams where they've got other relatively senior people reporting to them, and they're all kind of ready for this work. So there's a level of complexity of thinking already where they're kind of ready to kind of, okay, it's really good to have this highly defined role and ways to grow because I want to be able to be better at my job and get noticed for the next level, etc., etc. So that there's that. But what I've noticed is when you do it, is they pull other parts of the system towards them because everybody sees the difference that's happening as they begin to think this way, so that they
right.
change the system. So one of they do things that within the system that doesn't clash with what other people want or need because they've gone into the system as part of this development. They go, well, part of the role is to make sure we don't do stuff that creates 3 times the amount of work as for somebody else. So how do we then go and seed all of the stuff we want to do in this wider system? So if we do it, we've got allies who've bought into it before we do it, which then means we can do it without getting our heads smashed in by somebody who's got angry that they haven't been properly prepared and it's knocked onto it. So that's part of the role. How do you go into that system and that wider system and seed it? And when they do that, you've built a kind of a connective network. You've built these interdependencies, and so the information, the behaviours are going both ways, and other people in the system start saying, "What you're doing is quite different. How do I do that? How come your team all seem to be leaving work at 5:30, yet everything always seems to be done on time, and you never missed a deadline? What's going on here?" So that it's that kind of pull inwards, and then somebody else tries it and says, "Oh wow, yeah, this is helping me as well." So you build system. It's kind of a complex contagion of change through a system. It happens in clusters. And so this cluster does it, and then another cluster does it, and then another cluster does it. And eventually you get a huge number of people in the organisation operating that way. So it's a very active way of changing things. It's not like a top-down change and say, right, we're going to do this, you do that. It's going in, it's acting, it's doing it, and it's getting noticed because everybody else goes, wow, how do we do that? Because this is so effective.
You know, it's really interesting, I find. So some of the conversations I might host, there might be a degree of intimacy to them, or, you could say that there could be some degree of vulnerability in it, but just how, without saying words like vulnerable, not just saying putting up these banners, but actually living the thing,
Mm.
how open and receptive people are. When you were speaking there, it just kind of had me thinking, we've kind of brainwashed ourselves into thinking that we're at war with everybody, or we have to, there's this competitive side that will advance me ahead of everyone else. I think, and the more I've had these conversations with a really wide breadth of thinkers in different disciplines, just around the kind of undeniable sense of our interdependence. There's something about it, even when you mention human and making it more human. There's something about when you're pointing to something, when you're really living it yourself, you're actually just inviting people back to do something that they're really, like, we're naturally inclined to. Like, we're naturally inclined to be adaptive in interdependent systems. It's almost like the way of our culture, and especially even in the specific field we're talking about here, we've had such maladaptive practices that we think it might involve some big, messaging and program. This is how we get cultures to move. But as you say, it's the right people in the right place that are receptive to it at the right time. And then what you're actually asking them to do, it seems like a very natural and organic development from that, by virtue of the fact that you've almost asked people to do something that's just inherently human in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up quite well. All of the stuff that I read that underpins my thinking is stuff that works over centuries and across geographies. We have forgotten that's what works. We've built these highly technical systems and highly hierarchical and yeah, full of competitive people trying to play the game of how do I get promoted, and we've actually forgotten what connects people, um, what actually makes a difference in complex systems. We've almost seen it as anti-Western in the West, at least. And I'm based in APAC, so I guess I get it. I'm a little lucky that quite a few of the leaders that I work with, they say to me the last thing I want to do is go back to Europe or America because it's so much fun here. Because we are
Right.
working in this much more complex environment where I've got 15 different cultures reporting into me, and multiple different regulatory bodies and cultures and things. And actually, not only do not want to go back because I don't want to be part of this kind of control hierarchy, but it wouldn't be as fun. I wouldn't be able to have all of this interactive relationships. I wouldn't be able to do the work the way that I want to do it. So yeah, in Asia, we probably are a bit. They probably are a little bit more self-enrolling system. And when you talk to an Asian, they will instantly say, "Yes, of course, I play different roles everywhere I go." At home, my mum's a tiger mum. She can't see the way I play outside of my house because she'd be absolutely shocked. So I have to be able to toggle between those two roles. But and I think Western kids do it as well, but they do it and it's a rebellion rather
Right.
than this is the way life is. So the Western kids are like, oh, my mum tells me to be like that, but I'm like this, so I'm going to fight and scream and this is the authentic me. This and you're holding me back, and you're. Whereas the Asian kids just go, no, I'm obviously both things at once, and that's fine. So and I now have this third role to play, so I can also play that. So they move between role performances without stress, but they also don't think about themselves as deeply in terms of this scientific modelling of self. They have a very different relationship to self than perhaps we have in the West. So there's a little bit of cultural specificity, which is a tough word to
Yeah.
say,
Oh, I
um,
struggle with that.
in in um, in my experience, because I mean I've been in APAC for 20 years, but I think there is part of the human condition as well. We've always been able to do this, and we've somehow forgotten it because of this reductive scientism that has kind
Yeah.
of said you're this tiny thing that is bounded, that's got boundaries around it, and you can't. Now, I also think we are moving beyond that now. It's certainly in academic terms in the West, but it hasn't moved out of academia into the way we live our lives yet, and it potentially never will, because it's, with the battle against the academia now with these wider systems, it might always be trapped in the sort of the ether. The way to do it is to become more common sense about it, I think, and just try and talk about it in language that people can understand.
That idea, by the way, of just the following of an idea of an authentic self. But once again, I think you've touched on this in a number of different senses. The that in isolation again, as opposed to how it actually interacts with other people in your sphere. I hadn't thought about that before, but I think that's just something really interesting to sit with or contemplate it for anyone's idea of an authentic self, in terms of, does it take anyone else into consideration? Does it take into the kind of interrelationality of our existence? You've one thing that I wanted to ask about. You mentioned earlier just the cultivating of trust, and obviously, trust in a wider sense or societal sense. In certain parts of the world seems to be, we're well aware of trust, crumbling in certain ways, whether it's trust in systems or institutions or whatever it may be, even just and how people live and in between themselves. I have my own ideas, I guess, of where what you're talking about fits in with the development of trust, but just from how you see it, um, how do you see the kind of relationship between some of the ideas in relating you're talking about, and the cultivation of trust? How do you see that kind of working?
So I see it from a kind of a network systems perspective. So I don't think trust has disappeared. It's just evolved into something different. So Rachel Botsman talks about the evolution of trust from local to institutional to distributed. So the way I always think about this is, if you catch an Uber, or in my part of the world a Grab, would you get in an Uber that has a rating of 3.2? Almost certainly not. You're looking for these consistent ratings, because we can pretty easily judge the quality of a taxi ride. It's not that complex. But how do you trust in a very complex system? You don't trust the institutions, and it's very clear we don't trust institutions anymore, but you're still trusting something. And what you're doing is you're trusting clusters in the network, people you're connected to. Might be people you've never met. Could be a whole bunch of people with the same interest in a Facebook group, and you trust them, or you trust a whole bunch of people in a LinkedIn pod because they're all saying things. And now you might be trusting absolutely the wrong narratives, which is the notion of conspiracy theories. Is you start trusting a whole bunch, and everybody builds into it and builds into it, but trust is still there. So you look at the dynamics of this trust. You say, well, how do I go into a complex system and use those dynamics to get people to trust what I'm saying? So you need to be able to deliver clearly. You need to be able to have the credibility that you can do it in order to get the trust of these complex systems. But you also need to be able to think of it as a network. How do I get these nodes to trust me? And this is what I tell all of the people I work with, is that if you're going to do something that's changing the system in any way whatsoever, and you've got somebody to buy in, and then to get somebody else's buy-in, you have to change what you promised to that first person. Go and talk to them again. Not an email, not a text. Buy them a cup of coffee, go and talk to them again, and get their buy-in of the change. Because if you deliver something and you've promised them this and you deliver that, you've made an enemy for life. Because they thought they trusted you, and then you didn't give them what you told them you were going to give them. You've broken the trust. You're never, ever going to repair it. And so that, there's a real pragmatic element of this is, I go out and I tell this story to this person, I tell that story to the other person, I I change the story and I go back, and I don't have the purity of what I'm going to do. It has to adapt in a pragmatic way to what's required by the system. And then when I deliver it, it has all of these trade offs and provisos. But if I'm sophisticated enough and if the team I'm working with is sophisticated enough, we can still deliver it in a way that maintains trust. But the actual trust is always distributed into the system.
But just very much on an interpersonal level there, I think this is something that's deeply underappreciated. And I think it's even for our counterpart in whatever discussion it might be, for them to actually appreciate or understand that things change. Like, I don't mean to be too trite with the idea of change is the only permanent, but if I've committed to something and either, something in my health, my well-being, my personal circumstances changes significantly enough, and if I'm going to be willing to be upfront and transparent with someone, people can, and especially if there's some sort of human reason for it, people are inherently understanding. It's when we don't confront, because there's so many unknowns, right, that we'll never be able to even grasp how much of this life is unknown. But it's even just the very like, even in a complex system, the simplicity of dealing with the known, and handling it in a transparent way, I think that almost builds more trust. I've even found if I've lied to someone, or I've whatever way I want to dress that up, and if I go back and I say, by the way, that wasn't fully true, that's a wonderful basis to build more trust. Than just hopefully that issue never arises, and even my being then, or my kind of state around them is altered because of something that I have done, if you know what I mean. So I kind of love how in some of the things you're saying, that if we can just accept that there isn't a fixed answer, that we can't, that there isn't, that there's always going to be tensions, that there's always going to be contradictions. If we can act with some degree of, I guess, transparency within that, it can kind of come down to very simple moments, to be able to maintain our our growth in a complex system.
Well, and that's one of the things that I always talk about, that complex systems respond to simple rules.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they don't respond to complex rules. So, and that's one of the challenges that we have, is we put in more and more complicated and complex rules in order to try and control this complex system. And the more we do it, the less the system responds. So what you're trying to do is just look at, and this is where the self-enrolling system comes in. There's a whole, it's a simple rule. You are a self and a role in the system. How do you adapt the self to play the role according to system's expectations? And you can break that down to slightly more complicated instructions. But ultimately, that's what it is. It's a bunch of simple rules that help you navigate. And you're not ever going to know for sure whether you're right or wrong, but you can at least move in better or worse directions. And that navigation is absolutely central. And I think for me, that's core of what I do. I take leaders away from saying, "Well, this is the right way to lead," and say, "Well, you're navigating a system. All you really need to be able to do is consistently take better turns than worse turns. Yeah, even if you do take a worse turn, at least recognise quite quickly that it's a worse one, so that you can revert and take a better one again." Um, Relatively simple stuff. Um, but you have to in order to deliver it, you have to unlearn, or get people to unlearn an awful lot of other complicated stuff that gets in the way.
Absolutely. Richard, just looking at the time here, and thinking about, where we started, even in terms of the motivation for what question you're kind of exploring as you move through life, and just even in terms of making leadership more human, developmental, and honest again, uh, considering some of the ideas of reflection and the significance of that, being more relational with each other, this kind of honesty, but honesty and awareness, really, and not getting kind of too caught up in the self that we've created of ourselves, creating this superhero version of leadership in which we have to be all things at all times, getting trapped in that then by never being able to ask for help. Um, this the capacity then you've seen of the importance of just us being able to improvise, be experimental, explore. this really kind of big moment for you, even in terms of with what Nicola Robin was saying in terms of Indigenous leadership and the role of the shaman to be almost this quantum number generator, introducing this randomness, and so much of what you're saying seems to be about bringing us back to more of a lively, responsive, aware, alert, and making better decisions. We can never know absolutely where something will lead to, but much like in the dialogues you're talking about, the more that we can surface, the more that can be made, can be brought into our awareness, the better capacity ultimately we have to make better decisions. And even just this beautiful idea of how working with the leadership team and getting them to really live this awareness of their interdependence, just how naturally sometimes we can adapt or adopt that once more, because in some ways it is just in our human nature, and it seems to be a big element too of just this human aspect of the leadership work that you're developing or assist or helping people bring out. Really curious to ask you, Richard, the question of what is a good life for you.
Okay, so I'm going to loop back to my original question. So the original question, my original answer, which is like we have these broken, burnt out shell husks of people. So I think that the good life is the opposite of that. So if leadership, and I work with everyone in India. That's my life. So for me, a good life is trying to get these decent people away from being corporate marionettes. The people I work, the good life for me is always the person who writes to me on LinkedIn and said, "Oh my goodness, that's you've just changed the way I do something. You've changed the way I think. You've changed, and that's allowed me to make a difference in the work that I do. It's being able to teach MBA classes or executive MBA classes, and somebody coming up to me and saying, yeah, that was profound. I always expected there was stuff like that out there, but I didn't know how to find it. And this is this is transformational for me. To being able to do that kind of work for me is the good life. To being able to kind of get people to live that self-enrolled and system life, because I think that allows them to live a good life. So that they will do the hard work well, and they'll put some meaning back into the systems that forgot why they exist in the first place. So they're going to be just pushing these little systems into better places all the time. And then they've had a good life themselves. Now I'm removed from those systems now. My job is to help people navigate those systems. So my good life is knowing, and again through those LinkedIn messages, through things that come through on my Substack channel, through the students who tell me I've made a difference. That for me is the good life, is going off and doing that work. And it can be a 5 second comment that somebody says. And if I get that in the day, then that day's been a day worth living.
There's so much I love when I hear of someone's perspective, particularly in a certain field or something, just how applicable it is to an individual in their own constellation, whether it's family or friendship, work context. I like when it seems to apply to so much, and I think so much of what you were referring to throughout the course of this conversation, Richard, is definitely not just leadership specific, but just in the context of how we could live our own good lives. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I really, really enjoyed that.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been good fun.